Sanctions are designed to weaken economies, yet history shows they often accelerate the very shifts they aim to prevent. The paradox is that financial pressure intended to isolate a nation can instead reshape global power structures in unexpected ways. Economic systems operate on trust, liquidity, and interconnected trade flows that resemble a circulatory system. When sanctions disrupt these flows, the system does not simply stop, but reroutes in ways that create new financial pathways. Sovereign debt cycles play a critical role in how nations respond to external pressure. Countries under sanctions often increase borrowing, monetize deficits, or restructure trade to survive financial isolation. When access to global capital markets is restricted, governments turn inward and rely on central banks to finance spending. This process expands the money supply and introduces inflationary pressures that ripple through domestic economies. Sanctions also disrupt currency stability by reducing foreign exchange inflows. A weaker currency increases import costs, which in turn accelerates inflation and reduces purchasing power. The global financial system is built on the dominance of reserve currencies, particularly the US dollar. Sanctions leverage this dominance by restricting access to dollar-based transactions and international payment systems. However, this reliance on a single financial infrastructure creates vulnerabilities. When nations are excluded, they begin developing alternatives that gradually reduce dependence on the existing system. A historical example can be found in Iran following the 2012 sanctions targeting its banking sector. The restrictions cut Iran off from the SWIFT network, significantly reducing oil revenue and foreign trade capacity. Iran's GDP contracted sharply, and inflation surged above 30% within a year. Yet, the country adapted by increasing barter trade and using alternative currencies in bilateral agreements. Russia's experience after 2014 provides another case study of sanctions reshaping economic behavior. Following the annexation of Crimea, Western sanctions targeted Russian banks, energy firms, and access to capital markets. The ruble lost nearly half its value by early 2015, and inflation exceeded 15%. In response, Russia increased gold reserves and reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. The shift marked a strategic move toward financial independence. Russia also developed its own payment system, known as SPFS, to reduce reliance on SWIFT. China observed these developments closely and began expanding its cross-border interbank payment system. This system allowed international transactions in yuan, gradually promoting its currency in global trade. Sanctions often force targeted countries to deepen economic ties with alternative partners. This leads to the formation of parallel trade networks that operate outside traditional Western-dominated systems. Over time, these networks reduce the effectiveness of sanctions as a policy tool. What begins as isolation can evolve into the creation of a competing economic bloc. The pattern becomes clearer when examining debt monetization under pressure. Governments facing restricted revenues often rely on central banks to purchase government bonds. This process increases liquidity but devalues the currency. The resulting inflation acts as an indirect tax on citizens, redistributing wealth within the economy. A similar mechanism occurred during the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. Countries like Argentina and Brazil faced external debt burdens that led to currency devaluation and hyperinflation. Argentina's inflation rate exceeded 3,000% in 1989, illustrating the extreme consequences of monetary imbalance. These crises were not caused by sanctions alone, but by a combination of debt, currency pressure, and policy responses. Sanctions amplify these underlying vulnerabilities by restricting access to stabilizing capital flows. Without external financing, governments are forced into more aggressive monetary actions. Another historical parallel can be found in Iraq during the 1990s. Sanctions following the Gulf War severely limited oil exports, which were the country's primary source of revenue. The Iraqi dinar collapsed, and inflation reached extreme levels as the government printed money to cover expenses. This created widespread economic hardship and long-term structural damage. Despite these effects, sanctions did not achieve all intended political outcomes. Instead, they contributed to economic fragmentation and informal trade networks. Modern sanctions operate within a far more interconnected global economy. Digital finance, alternative payment systems, and regional alliances have changed how countries respond to financial restrictions. The 2022 sanctions on Russia marked one of the most extensive economic actions in modern history. Over $300 billion in foreign reserves were frozen, and major banks were cut off from global financial systems. Initially, the ruble collapsed, and markets reacted with significant volatility. However, Russia implemented capital controls and required energy payments in rubles, stabilizing the currency. Energy exports were redirected toward countries willing to continue trade. This shift demonstrated how commodity demand can offset financial restrictions. At the same time, global markets experienced rising energy prices. This created inflationary pressures in sanctioning countries, illustrating unintended economic consequences. Sanctions are often compared to economic warfare, yet unlike traditional warfare, the effects are distributed across global markets rather than confined to a single region. Supply chains adjust, prices fluctuate, and new alliances form. These adjustments can weaken the original intent of the sanctions over time. The role of the US dollar in global trade is central to this dynamic. Approximately 80% of global trade transactions involve the dollar in some capacity. Sanctions leverage this dominance by limiting access to dollar clearing systems. However, repeated use of this tool encourages diversification away from the dollar. Countries begin settling trade in alternative currencies. Bilateral agreements between nations reduce reliance on traditional financial intermediaries. This gradual shift does not happen overnight. It occurs through incremental changes that accumulate over time. Gold has reemerged as a strategic reserve asset in this context. Central banks have increased gold purchases as a hedge against financial restrictions. In 2022, global central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold, the highest level in decades. This trend reflects a desire to reduce exposure to currency-based sanctions. Digital currencies are also part of this evolving landscape. Central bank digital currencies aim to provide alternative payment mechanisms outside traditional systems. China's digital yuan is one example of this shift. It allows cross-border transactions that bypass conventional financial infrastructure. Sanctions also affect global investment patterns. Capital flows adjust as investors seek stability and predictability in uncertain environments. Emerging markets may experience both risks and opportunities. Some benefit from redirected trade, while others face volatility from shifting financial conditions. The interconnected nature of modern finance means no country is entirely insulated. Economic pressure applied to one region can transmit through global networks. Inflation in one part of the world can influence interest rates elsewhere. This creates a feedback loop that complicates monetary policy decisions. Central banks must respond to these pressures carefully. Raising interest rates can stabilize currencies but may slow economic growth. Lowering rates can stimulate growth but risk further inflation. This balancing act becomes more difficult in a fragmented global system. Sanctions contribute to this fragmentation by altering trade relationships. Over time, the global economy becomes less unified and more regionalized. Regional trade blocs gain importance in this environment. Countries prioritize economic partnerships that offer stability and mutual benefit. The shift toward multipolar economic structures is gradual but significant. It reflects a redistribution of financial influence across regions. Debt remains a central factor in this transformation. High levels of sovereign debt limit the ability of governments to respond to external shocks. In 2023, global debt exceeded $300 trillion, highlighting the scale of financial obligations. This creates systemic risk that can be amplified by geopolitical tensions. Sanctions can accelerate debt-related vulnerabilities. Reduced revenues and higher borrowing costs strain government finances. Currency depreciation increases the cost of servicing foreign-denominated debt. This can lead to default or restructuring in extreme cases. Financial crises often follow similar patterns. Debt accumulation leads to instability, which is triggered by external shocks or policy changes. Sanctions can act as one of these triggers. They expose weaknesses that already exist within an economy. The response to these shocks determines long-term outcomes. Effective policy can stabilize conditions, while mismanagement can deepen crises. History shows that economic systems are resilient but not immune. They adapt to pressure, often in ways that reshape the global landscape. Sanctions are one form of pressure within this system. Their effects extend beyond immediate economic impact to influence long-term structural change. The emergence of alternative financial systems is a direct response to repeated sanctions. These systems aim to reduce vulnerability to external control. Over time, this reduces the concentration of financial power. It creates a more distributed and complex global economy. However, fragmentation also introduces inefficiencies. Multiple systems increase transaction costs and reduce overall economic integration. This trade-off between resilience and efficiency defines the current transition. Countries must navigate these challenges while maintaining growth. Energy markets illustrate this dynamic clearly. Shifts in supply routes and pricing mechanisms reflect changing economic alliances. The use of local currencies in energy trade is increasing. This reduces dependence on traditional financial intermediaries. At the same time, global demand continues to drive competition. Resource-rich nations gain leverage in negotiations. Sanctions can unintentionally strengthen these positions. By limiting supply, they increase the strategic importance of alternative sources. This creates a complex web of cause and effect. Actions taken to isolate one economy can reshape entire industries. The banking sector is also affected by these changes. Financial institutions must adapt to new regulations and risks. Compliance with sanctions adds operational complexity. Banks must monitor transactions and manage exposure to restricted entities. This increases costs and reduces efficiency. Smaller institutions may struggle to keep up with these demands. Technology plays a critical role in managing these challenges. Advanced systems are used to track transactions and ensure compliance. However, technology also enables alternative financial networks. Decentralized systems can operate outside traditional frameworks. This dual role highlights the evolving nature of finance. Innovation can both support and challenge existing structures. The long-term implications of sanctions are still unfolding. Patterns observed in history provide insight into possible outcomes. One likely outcome is a more diversified global financial system. Multiple currencies and payment systems will coexist. This reduces reliance on any single system. It also introduces new risks and complexities. Another implication is increased geopolitical competition. Economic tools become central to international strategy. Sanctions will continue to be used as leverage. Their effectiveness will depend on how quickly alternatives develop. The balance of power in the global economy is shifting. The shift is driven by both policy decisions and market forces. Understanding these dynamics is essential for navigating the future. Economic systems are shaped by both intention and unintended consequences. The paradox remains at the center of this transformation. Sanctions designed to enforce control can accelerate decentralization. This creates a feedback loop that reshapes global finance. Each action influences the next phase of adaptation. The world order is not changed overnight. It evolves through a series of interconnected events and decisions. Sanctions are one of many forces driving this evolution. Their impact extends far beyond immediate economic outcomes. The evidence suggests a clear pattern. Pressure leads to adaptation, which leads to structural change. This pattern has repeated throughout modern economic history. It continues to unfold in today's global system. The future will likely reflect a more complex and multipolar financial landscape. This will require new approaches to policy and cooperation. The final insight is not that sanctions fail, but that they transform. Their true impact lies in how they reshape the systems they aim to control.